We have a tradition every year. When Jack, you were with me last year, and first time we did it in the War Room. We've had a tradition. I did it at the Breitbart radio show for many, many years, but it's to do on Christmas Day to really do a special celebration and to tell the combat history of Christmas through the eyes and experiences of American fighting men and women, not simply throughout the world, but also on American soil. We talk about the American Revolution. We talk about the Civil War. We get into it all. And every year we're honored, since we first started this many years ago, by the combat historian, I think the finest combat historian of his generation, Patrick K. O'Donnell. And today we're going to be going through the American Revolution. We're going to talk about the Battle of the Bulge and Hurtgen Forest and everything in World War II. Going to go to Korea, the Italy campaign in World War II. Also about the Civil War. We've got a lot to talk about today. Really want to have a day of. Obviously, it's the most important holiday in America, I think people would say, and we've always enjoyed doing this and making sure that our veterans and our military people are honored, in addition to letting the country know that just because it's Christmas Day, it doesn't mean that servicemen throughout the world have not been sacrificing. In fact, I would argue, and I think Patrick K. O'Donnell, when we bring him in, is going to argue that if we hadn't had used Christmas as a kind of a cover, there might not be an American Republic. The tent might have been folded on this one pretty quickly. So let's bring in now Patrick K. O'Donnell, our honored combat historian. Patrick, thank you very much for continuing our many-year tradition of the combat history of Christmas. So thank you for joining us. And I want to go through just briefly how, I continue to say, as you've come on and you're a massive audience favorite here over many, many years, I think you're the finest combat historian of your generation, because your books really put you in the fight. You don't do a lot of top level strategy or top level big picture about campaigns. You really get down to where the fighting is, and you tell the story in a very human term. Number one, let's to do an introduction. Give people your background and how you and how you got into this.
My entire life has practically been American history in one way or another. It began when I was 2 or 3, and I just got into World War II, just like many other kids. And I was reading avidly, and I was dragging my parents to battlefields, Civil War battlefields, Revolutionary War battlefields, when I was 3 and 4 years old, 5 years old. My father would say to me, "You've seen one, you've seen them all." And I'd be like, "No, Dad, we haven't, and we've got to go to another one." And this is something that I did as a kid, and I currently do. I actually visit and walk all the places that I write about. If that's overseas, I visit them overseas. But I also interview the veterans, and I've interviewed close to 5,000 veterans from World War I through Afghanistan and Iraq. And the bulk of those veterans were World War II veterans, and these are true American heroes. I mean, my friends, some of the friends that I've made are people that literally changed the course of history. And I've also been in combat. I was a civilian combat historian, but I was assigned to a rifle platoon in the Battle of Fallujah. And I have a book called We Were One, which is on the Commandant's reading list right now, which is required reading for Marines. It's about our story as 1st Platoon, Lima Company 3-1 in the Battle of Fallujah, which took some of the most casualties of the entire battle. And I was with them fighting through the Jolan house to house. My books are very personal. They're about people. They're about stories, and they're kind of microhistory in many cases that tell a larger story. And each one of the books that I've written has found me in one way or another. And that's certainly the case with the first book that we're going to talk about, which is Washington's Immortals. And the story there is a Christmas story as well. But Washington's Immortals found me in the summer of, I think, 2010, when the battalion commander of 3-1 said, "I'm in New York. Would you like to just hang out and go to the Med or somewhere?" I said, "Well, why don't we do a battlefield tour of Brooklyn?" And We met up at a place called Greenwood Cemetery. And this is one of the most interesting cemeteries in the United States. It's a cemetery, but it's also a battlefield. And here in the summer of 1776, it was the largest battle of the American Revolution up until that point. And we walked up and down the hills of Greenwood Cemetery where the Marylanders for Washington's Immortals fought, and they held back the British, but they fell back to a stone house, which was their kind of headquarters. And it was here that I found with the colonel a rusted old sign that said, "Here lie 256 Continental soldiers, Maryland heroes." Somewhere in New York City, in Brooklyn, are buried these American heroes that literally were involved in one of the greatest small unit engagements in American history that hardly anybody knows about until I wrote Washington's Immortals. They made an epic stand, an American Thermopylae, where they held off thousands of British soldiers, creating an hour more precious in our history, according to one contemporary historian at the time, than any other. They allowed the American army, the bulk of it being near Greenwood Cemetery and elsewhere, to retreat back to their entrenchments in Brooklyn by buying time in this engagement where they charged multiple times.
Let me just set the stage. This is where the Washington's army is the really first, I guess, of that army, the field engagement, and they were getting rolled up across Long Island. I mean, this is, I don't think we even call it a strategic retreat. In many regards, they were just cutting and running, or they weren't, because the British landed so many troops in, I guess, southern Long Island and weren't prepared for it. But this stand at this stone house gave that hour, that precious hour that allowed them to get back to, I guess, Brooklyn Heights and actually dig in and actually be able to take a stand. Is that generally the question? That's why this is so important?
What's going on here. But let me also point out that this is a point in American history where all could have been lost. They were in a position to inflict a crushing defeat that would have captured more than half of the Continental Army, as well as potentially Washington himself. But they retreat back to their entrenchments, and it's here that they buy this time. They chew up daylight during this series of bayonet attacks, which are forlorn. Many of these men are dead after the attacks. They sacrificed themselves for the army. And that's where I found, the story so compelling. Who were these men? The sacrifice that they've made, and they're buried somewhere, just under a street or probably a sidewalk somewhere in Brooklyn. There's no memorial hardly at all. And this really should be a national battlefield. And there should be more recognition of these men and the sacrifices of the Battle of Brooklyn, for that matter. But they make their way back to the entrenchments, and they're able to fortify themselves. But Washington has a decision to make. Does he make a stand or does he retreat? And this is one of the great stories in American history. It's an American Dunkirk that occurs next. And a nor'easter sets in where both armies are kind of static. They're in their entrenchments, and they're not able to really move. They're pelted by hail and severe storms. And Washington decides to retreat. And it's on the shoulders of really my next book. It's called The Indispensables, which will be out in May. You can pre-order it now on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, where the entire war is literally saved also. These men who are from Marblehead, Massachusetts, are able to transport 9,500 Americans across the East River in the dead of night. It's an amazing story. One wave after another. They make several.
Just to set this, that they retreat. And by the way, this was essentially close to a broken army, and this was fairly close after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. I mean, people think the Declaration, of all the films and musicals have been done about it, and obviously the 4th of July was kind of, oh, we signed this document, we had our freedom. You're talking, what, 90 days afterwards, 120 days afterwards, you're in a battle. You're in a fight that's basically going to put the Republic it's going to destroy the Republic. You're sitting now with essentially a shattered army at Brooklyn Heights, right there by where the Brooklyn Bridge is, I take it today, and somehow they got to get across the East River to Manhattan to be able to hold Manhattan or to even retreat further, right? And that's where the indispensables, the immortals held at the Stone House, but then you have to somehow transport this army, what's left of this army, to save it across the East River, which looks impossible. By the way, Patrick, hang on 1 second. We're taking a commercial break. Got a commercial break. Oh, hang on. I'm sorry. Just keep going. My clock is a little messed up here. So just keep rolling.
This is in the middle of the night where a British army can attack. It's also in a swirling river, the East River, which is over a mile long and treacherous with currents and everything else. These men, with their skill, which is honed by fishing in the Grand Banks, they're some of the most skilled sailors in the world, transport the entire army across the river. But there is also something that occurs, which is a providential act, which many people consider. A fog sets in at the right time, at the right place, and screens the movement of the army as they cross the river at this time. And the other thing that occurs is the wind is favorable to them, but not to the British Navy, which is right in the river as well. And they're able to come back behind the entrenchments if they have the right wind, but they don't have the wind. The wind favors the Marbleheaders, and they're able to bring the army across. And it's truly one of the most amazing military evacuations in world history.
So the American Dunkirk, where did these men come from? Where do these men, because they take part of the story when we get to the Christmas Day part of it, or the Christmas season part of it. Where did these guys, how did they come from Marblehead all the way down? How did they end up in an army that's fighting on Long Island and Brooklyn?
They come from Marblehead, Massachusetts. And this story, the Indispensables, begins really in 1769, and these men are the beginning of the American Revolution. They are the mainspring, in many cases, of the American Revolution. They're the ideas of the American Revolution. For instance, one of the main characters in my book is Elbridge Gerry, the future Vice President of the United States and Congressman. But Elbridge Gerry, many of his ideas shaped the United States. Everything from the
Patrick, hang on 1 second. I want to get to him and do it right because we got to take a commercial break now. My clock's been a little off here. Patrick K. O'Donnell. The book is Washington's Immortals and Washington's Indispensables. The Indispensables go out in May. We're here with the combat history at Christmas. We're setting up to get to Trenton and the attack that saved the American Republic. Patrick K. O'Donnell will return with us in a moment.
War Room with Stephen K. Bannon. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Okay, we're here with the combat history of Christmas in the War Room. It's Christmas Day, the 25th of December, the year of our Lord 2020, a year that no one will ever forget. We have a saying here, I think it's taken, they say it's either Marx or Lenin, or I think it's Lenin, that there are decades in which nothing happens and then there are weeks in which decades happen. And when we talk to the combat historian Patrick K. O'Donnell, we're talking about those types of weeks in which decades happen. I want to go back now. We're starting off, as we always do, with the American Revolution, and it's setting up for the incredible Battle of Trenton, which really saved this republic. But people, Patrick, don't realize how close this was to all collapsing very early on Long Island, in the Battle of Brooklyn, the American Dunkirk to get the army from Brooklyn Heights back to Manhattan, and then even to escape across the Hudson over to from Fort Washington to Fort Lee. But walk us through what excites me about the Washington's Immortals was a bestseller. And we had so many of our audience members loved it. And we had you on so many times. They could not get enough of this story of this heroic, I guess, Maryland regiment that has kind of faded into history, faded into from memory until you came back and found them. And you really found it on giving a battlefield tour with some of your colleagues from the Battle of Fallujah in Iraq, and just went around and going around Brooklyn when they saw a plaque, I guess, on the side of a wall that pointed to where 256, I guess in an unmarked grave, these heroes buried near where this historic battle took place. But then your new book, The Indispensables, really talks about those individuals that were basically the sailors and the watermen that from Marblehead, Massachusetts, that got the Army across the river, and then they play a role later in our story. Tell us about the Indispensables. Who are they, and why are they important?
It's really an extraordinary unknown story as well, Steve. These men were the mainspring of the American Revolution in terms of their ideas. They financed the American Revolution at the beginning. They're some of the wealthiest men in the colonies. They build an empire on codfish, and fishing in Massachusetts is over 35% of the economy during the Revolution. And these men are, the equivalent of, in many cases, of billionaires of today. And it's them. They are the ones that have this fire of liberty in their bellies. They financed the revolution at the beginning. They come up with many of the ideas that we now know. And they're the ones that are hoarding and supplying the army with the all-crucial supply of powder, which gunpowder during the time of the American Revolution was absolutely a critical element that was very, very, very limited during the American Revolution at the beginning of the war, because we didn't have hardly any organic production. So these men in their shipping converted their shipping lines into supply lines, and they brought the powder from Spain and elsewhere from Europe and brought it to the army. And they also formed the Navy. They were the first vessels that would attack British ships, and they would seize vital powder as well there, and other munitions and armaments. So they play an incredibly important role in shaping the United States, forming the Navy, and then transporting Washington's army in many times and places. But they're also an incredible land unit as well. They fight on land. But these men are the source of my next book, and it's a really an origin story of our founding, as well as a combat history of the Revolution. And they fight through some of our darkest days as we get into, after the Battle of Brooklyn. It's one disaster.
Yeah, by the way, it was one catastrophe. It was one dark day, and this is within the shadow of the signing of the Declaration. I mean, the reality is the British didn't take it all that seriously, because they sent a large field army, but this was a disorganized. The Continental Army, although brave and had stick-to-itiveness and steadfastness, it was one defeat after the other. So take us. We now get to Manhattan. How do we get across into New Jersey and then down eventually to southern New Jersey?
There's really, it's the Declaration of Independence was signed with the blood of Washington's immortals with their stand. They sacrificed themselves to allow the army to escape, and the Indispensables then transported over to Manhattan. And then roughly 2 weeks later, the British land again in Kips Bay, and they attacked Manhattan and were pushed back. Washington's immortals, as well as the Marbleheaders, are part of the rear guard that allows the army to escape to Harlem Heights. They make stands at what's now Central Park, for instance, at McGowan Pass. For those that are in Manhattan and Brooklyn, the place is steeped with history in plain sight that hardly anybody knows about. There's just some amazing stuff, in many cases not properly marked, but there's an amazing history of the United States there that it really has an impact on our entire country. They make their way back towards Harlem Heights. They have a Battle of Harlem where it's an American victory, but that's rather short-lived, and it's really one defeat after another. The biggest being the Battle of Fort Washington, which is now the base of the Washington Bridge. There was a massive fort there that was over 2 miles long, that over nearly 5,000 Continental soldiers defended. And many of these men were then captured by the British, and it's one of the largest roll-ups of American prisoners of war.
Was that, by the way, many of those went to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, or went to those prison ships. But was that a mistake for Washington to take a stand there at Fort Washington on the Manhattan side of the Hudson River, or should he have used the indispensables and others to get off quick, earlier and to get to New Jersey and at least somehow save the Army and get to safety?
It was clearly a mistake. The Manhattan was indefensible because the British Navy could attack it at any point with their, massive amphibious capabilities. So there was no way to really defend Manhattan. Washington didn't even really want to, but it was political pressure from Congress and others that forced him to make a stand in Manhattan. But it was really a bridge too far to try to defend Fort Washington. It was General Greene, one of his most able generals, that insisted that they hold Fort Washington, and he fell to that advice, and unfortunately, thousands of Americans are captured, and I capture that in Washington's Immortals. With the book is a kind of band of brothers on the American Revolution. It's focused on the main characters, and much of the story is in their own words, using the great oral histories, mostly untold oral histories of the American Revolution. I did this with the indispensables as well. There's something called pension files. And if you survived the Revolutionary War, you'd go down to the local courthouse, and this is in 1818 and in the 1820s, and you'd swear under oath what you saw and did. And those pension files can be incredibly graphic and revealing. For instance, one of the men in the book was one of the lucky guys. He was in Fort Washington, but escaped in a rowboat across the Hudson. And he landed on the other side and recalls seeing Washington view the disastrous assault on Fort Washington unfold through a spyglass. And he talked about how Lawrence Everhart recalls how Washington had tears in his eyes as he was seeing the fort fall, and many of his men were literally run through a gauntlet of Hessian soldiers. These are German mercenaries that fought for the British or Allies, and British soldiers, and they ran through this gauntlet. They were punched, kicked, in some cases stabbed by bayonet, and robbed of their belongings, or in some cases even killed. And as this was unfolding, Everhart recalled it in his pension file. So this is the great untold oral history of the American Revolution, and very few authors have ever tapped that source, and I did it with Washington's Immortals and with the Indispensables, where I literally rebuilt the entire regiment through the pension files and the muster rolls that are out there. And so their words and their views are revealed, in many cases for the first time in hundreds of years. How close
a thing? We got about 2 minutes. How close an operation was it to get across the Hudson and actually get to the relative safety of New Jersey, the remnants of the Army to New Jersey?
The good thing is that the Army, for the most part, they went up north. They went up through the Army after the Battle of Fort Washington. They fought in an area called at the tip of Manhattan, and they kept falling back to White Plains, New York, and there was an epic battle there. And we were able, the Marbleheaders and the Marylanders were able to delay the British long enough for the Army to escape up north and across and move up towards New York and then over towards New Jersey ultimately. And it's the British that actually crossed the Hudson River and attacked Fort Lee, and it was a disaster as well. They captured the fort and almost all the supplies that were in it, and the Army was in full retreat. And the Army was, it begins somewhere around 20,000, and it is diminishing quickly after every single defeat. There's multiple cases of smallpox, disease, etc., and combat
Patrick, Patrick, hang over a second. We're going to take a quick commercial break. When we get back, we're going to take this Army now down to its one defeat after the next until they get to Christmas. Patrick K. O'Donnell, combat historian, the combat history of Christmas. We're in the American Revolution, and we're going to return on War Room in just a moment.
War Room with Stephen K. Bannon. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Merry Christmas. It is December 25th, the year of our Lord 2020. Combat history of Christmas. And we're now in the year 1776 and a crisis for the young American Republic. In fact, a crisis that may permanently shut it down. And it really starts less than, 6 weeks after the signing of the Declaration. Everybody today, the way they taught American history, think, hey, the Declaration signed, we're a free country, let's go on and get on with it. Nothing could be further from the truth. That's when the British really started to take it very seriously. They landed massive amount of combat troops, a field army, basically around late August, within 60 days of the signing of the Declaration. So that army was already en route. They landed an army in Long Island, and it essentially rolled up the Continental Army all the way, basically in one defeat after the next, with heroic stands all over the place, but basically rolled them up till they got to New Jersey. Now, Patrick, the question gets to be, there was tremendous pressure. People don't realize this. A lot of folks don't realize there was tremendous pressure at that time, given how the Continental Army had essentially held together but been in a series of defeats. There was big pressure to actually relieve General Washington of his command by the time we get to the Advent season, I think around Thanksgiving in December. Was it General Charles Lee? I mean, there was a lot of people in Philadelphia that were talking about, we got to make a change here or we're not going to have an army.
Yeah, the disaster at Fort Washington politically changes things for Washington. There's a real talk of replacing him with General Charles Lee, who's a very seasoned soldier. He'd fought in Europe for the British Army and elsewhere, and was very odd and strange character. He had a lot of peculiar mannerisms. He was a bit of a loner, and he always had to have a 3 or 4 dogs, his dogs, surrounding him constantly. But he was considered the first choice to relieve Washington, and he was stabbing Washington behind the back and using his contacts in Congress to eventually get himself positioned as the commander in chief. But sort of a miracle happens in many ways. The British, under Bannister Cornwallis and another British officer, capture, in a daring kind of cavalry-like raid, they capture Charles Lee, who is sleeping in a tavern in New Jersey. And they capture Lee, and what happens next is he's a prisoner of war of the British. And what we don't know for another 50 or so years is that Charles Lee was also a traitor. He gave information to the British Army on how the British could defeat the American cause and what his opinions were. But none of that is known during the Revolution. And he spends a year in captivity and eventually is released. And then Washington then entrusts him with leadership at the Battle of Monmouth initially. And there's some disastrous results. But the silver lining in all of this is that George Washington is the commander-in-chief and remains so, who's the indispensable man of the Revolution. Washington learned from his defeats, but he's a master of strategy and tactics, and also an alliance builder. And he's the man that can keep everybody together in these dark times. And this is some of the darkest period in American history. One defeat after another leads to political disaster. People are abandoning the cause left and right. In New Jersey, for instance, citizens are given the ability to sign. They can sign an alliance of allegiance with the British, and they're pardoned. And people line up in droves, including several congressmen, do this, that were signers of the Declaration of Independence. And the cause appears lost. I mean, New Jersey is being occupied. The army, which disintegrates, is down to thousands and hundreds of thousands of men as they retreat as quickly as possible to what they consider the safety of Pennsylvania and the Delaware River, because there are farms there that can support the Continental cause. And some of the great stories in the book are, one is Charles Wilson Peel, who's his brother James Peel is a Marylander. He's at the crossing, and there's these massive pyres of flame as raft after raft crosses the Delaware River to bring the army to safety. But one of the men that falls out of line is bound in rags. He has no shoes on. His face is full of sores and is swollen. And he looks at the guy, and he suddenly realizes that it's his brother. That's how bad a condition he was. The army makes it back to the other side, and it's even more desperate. All the enlistments for the army are expiring either on December 15th, in early December, or at the end of December, January 1. So Washington has to strike. He has to turn the tide with some sort of a counteroffensive that potentially could change the course of the war, because all is about to be lost. And this is where the remarkable Battle of Trenton takes place. It's a masterstroke, really. There was a series of outposts in New Jersey.
Hang on a sec. I want to. How does he come up with the plan? Now you're in December. I guess Charles Lee's been captured. Your army's down to a couple of thousand men. You don't even know you're going to be housed. You've had at least one signer. This was very controversial because people tried to deny it later. But I think you had one signer of the Constitution from New Jersey that actually signed a Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is signed requesting a pardon. This is within 4 or 5 months of the Declaration actually being debated and signed. This is as dark as it gets in American history. How does Washington, with only now a couple thousand men, and really hasn't won except for a couple of stands at Harlem and other places, White Plains, hasn't really won a major engagement. How does he come up with an idea of going on offense?
Well, the British have sort of a dilemma on their hands. They have to. It's the same stuff that we have to deal with today, right? They have to seize the ground and then hold it, and then protect the population. So what they do is they set up a series of fortifications or encampments where they try to control New Jersey. And one of those encampments is at Trenton. And it's guarded by their Hessian allies. These are Germans under the command of Johann Rall. There's about over 1,000 German soldiers, a handful of British cavalry, but it's mostly these Hessian soldiers, which are hardened combat troops. Johann Rall was literally born into war. His father, he's part of the regiment as a drummer boy and everything else. He literally grew up in war, and was one of the most seasoned and hardened commanders of the Hessian army, and he was an incredible hero too. We talked about Fort Washington earlier. It was Johann Rall that led the breakthrough. It was at White Plains that Johann Rall and his men also lead the breakthrough. But they're given the inglorious honor of guarding Trenton, and they're outnumbered and outgunned. And the American army is constantly raiding them with probing attacks and everything else. And Rall's men are on high alert every day, every night. They're being hit by raids and everything else. So this myth that we've heard about them, being drunk at Christmas is not true. These are highly trained and seasoned soldiers that are on high alert. And a series of things happen that Washington decides to attack Trenton, which is a garrison that is within reach of the Continental Army, but they have to get across the Delaware River. And that is in itself a major obstacle, because on Christmas Day, there was a nor'easter, and it was an incredibly, the waters were treacherous. There was ice floats, there was chunks of ice, there were swirling parts of the river. It was impassable. Washington had several prongs of his army attempt to cross the river below Trenton, for instance. They all failed. They were not able to cross the river because they did not have the indispensables guiding the boats. And that's where the Marbleheaders, once again, literally saved the war and saved the army. They are in charge of the amphibious river crossing, the assault river crossing at Delaware. they man the boats and they crew the boats, and they somehow are able to make it across this very treacherous river.
But hang on 1 second. We got a couple minutes left in this segment. I just got to reset for a second. Here's an army that essentially, Jack, has not won any major engagement, and you're telling me that they're now conceived a plan to do one of the toughest things you do: a river crossing at night in winter, get a beachhead, and then attack a highly trained combat force of battle-hardened mercenaries from Europe, the Hessians, probably the Germans, probably not the most innovative or most maneuverable, but guys that know how to stand their ground. How does Washington, one, come up with this idea, and how does he sell it to the officer corps? Because you would think an army that hadn't done anything but essentially retreat, how are they going to do what is beyond a crapshoot? I mean, it is in military, tactics, people will tell you this is one of the hardest things you can possibly do. The only harder thing would be under live enemy fire. But how are you going to camouflage yourself, and how are you going to get across in the night, in the middle of winter, right? And why did they pick Christmas?
It's a miracle, Steve, in many ways. This operation works, and people have no idea how difficult it was. He convenes a council of war. He actually convenes two councils of war. The first council of war is one for the British prying eyes, because he knows that there are spies in the camp, and he provides misinformation. The second council of war is with his most trusted captains of battle. And there he devises the plan to attack Trenton. But even with all of that security and the disinformation, the British they know that the attack is coming. This is something most people don't know. Their intelligence is able to know that attack is coming. They just don't know where and when specifically. But they suspect it's Trenton. And Johann Rall is informed that an attack is coming that night, in fact, and he readies his men. And what happens next is sort of a miracle, and an accident. A guy by the name of Stevens, who's with Virginia, decides to, for sort of a revenge operation, attack early without orders. And he sends about 100 guys across, and they attack. And it's part of a raid. And they sort of melt away, and the nor'easter is raging at this point as they're crossing the river. Johann Rall, we think, assumes that is the main attack. And he starts to go to bed as he's playing checkers that night, that the attack has already been made. And nobody would attack in the middle of a nor'easter. But meanwhile, Washington's army, thanks to the Marbleheaders, crosses successfully and comes through the top of Trenton.
Patrick, let's hang on right there. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the crossing and actually the attack, the crossing on Christmas night, and the attack early on the 26th. Patrick K. O'Donnell is our guest. This is the combat history of Christmas on War Room. We'll be back in just a moment.
War Room with Stephen K. Bannon. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Welcome back to War Room. It is our combat history of Christmas, Christmas Day. It's the 25th of December, the year of our Lord 2020. Our guest, Jack Maxey, and I are here in the War Room. Our guest is Patrick K. O'Donnell. We're I guess late in the evening of the 25th of Christmas Day of 1776, and it's one of the darkest hours in American history. General Washington has conceived this plan to do a crossing of the Delaware River in the middle of a northeaster for an army that really hasn't had a victory. His army, in Saratoga they had, but his army had not. He was under intense criticism and under a lot of pressure to potentially be relieved for cause when he conceived this plan at a council of war. And then crossed. So how does the main body, what time do they leave? How do they actually get across the river? And then how do they surprise the Hessians?
The nor'easter is screening the movement of the Marbleheaders as they cross the Delaware River. They then are over 10 miles above or north of Trenton as they make the crossing and they assemble. And the Army, it takes, a fair amount of time to get the Army over. And then they start the march. Even though they're at this point, they're delayed, they're behind schedule. The goal is to get to Trenton before dawn to attack and surprise the Hessians. And they then move south towards Trenton at this point, and they have security measures in place where they sort of detain people. The Americans, some are loyalist Americans that potentially alert the British that the army is on its way. It's on the march, and in fact, that's what, according to legend, that's what when one of those individuals does. They send a servant to Rawl with the message that the Washington is on the march and he's approaching Trenton. And Rawl at this time, according to legend, is playing checkers and receives the note and puts it in his pocket and never reads it. And he then goes to bed with the assumption that the attack had already occurred earlier in the day, thanks to Stevens and the probing raid. But Washington attacks and marches, and then shortly after dawn, in the morning, at daylight, they attack, and the Hessians make quite an epic stand. But part of the battle that is not well known is it's the Marbleheaders that march down the south side of Trenton, and they seize a crucial bridge across the Assunpink Creek. And this is Rawl's escape route. And they seize the high ground and the bridge, and then they start to attack outward from there. And Rawl is a very seasoned commander. He wants to retreat because this is what happens in most engagements during the American Revolution. They're not decisive. There's a set battle and they retreat. But here, Rawl fights to the death. He actually charges forward. There's misinformation. He doesn't know that the bridge still, actually, at the point that he could have made the order, was still open, but doesn't make it. He attacks Washington, and what occurs next is a crushing defeat for the Hessians. They are surrounded, and it's a double envelopment, which rarely occurs during the American Revolution. And the entire Hessian garrison, nearly the entire Hessian garrison, is captured or killed. And it's Johann Rawl that is also hit, and he's on his deathbed. And it's there that the note is revealed, supposedly, that he, says that if he only read the note, he would have been able to take appropriate measures. But it's here that this is a crushing defeat for the British. The attack is, beautifully executed, and Washington doesn't want to try his luck. He decides to take the army back across the Delaware. And it's kind of interesting. They have more casualties on the return than they did on the initial voyage, because they found the British or the Hessians' rum supply and start drinking heavily. And it's a drunken cruise on the way back across the Delaware. Several men fall overboard, but they have all these Hessian prisoners in tow, along with their weapons and many cannon, and they sit there and wait. And the plan is to not necessarily attack. They've got, a major victory here on their hands. But what happens is a series of events take place that sort of force Washington's hand. A gentleman by the name of John Cadwalader and the Philadelphia Associators, this is a militia group, they were part of that initial group, those two groups that tried to cross. They failed on Christmas Day. They then cross a day or so later, and they're on the New Jersey side. So Washington has a decision to make. Does he support Cadwalader along with the New Jersey militia groups that are now rising up because of this great Trenton victory? So he decides to cross again. And they cross back over to Trenton, but they don't make the mistake that Johann Rawl makes, and that's to try to fight and defend at Trenton. They fight on the high ground on the opposite side of Assunpink Creek and that bridge. And that's where that bridge is so important as well. It's one of those bridges. I wrote an article in Breitbart called "Bridges Saved America," and it's sort of true. It's another epic, largely unknown story where the Army all could have been lost again at Assunpink Creek. And this is a picture of the battle at Assunpink Creek. They line up on the opposite side of Assunpink Creek. And Cornwallis, after the defeat at Trenton, they charge forward as quickly as they can to Trenton. And Washington slows that army down with some of Edward Hand's expert riflemen. But they're able to advance to Trenton and to the bridge in the afternoon, shortly after New Year's. And it's there that they make an epic stand. It's really an incredible story. And here, Washington is by his men. His horse is literally touching the side of the bridge. He's urging his men on, and the Hessians and the elite light infantry Jaegers from the Hessian army
Patrick, hang on one second. We're going to continue on with America's first Christmas, 1776, and the fighting that took place over Christmas. Our short commercial break. We're going to be back with the second hour of War Room. Patrick K. O'Donnell, combat historian, is with us. Jack Maxey, Steve Bannon in the War Room. Short commercial break. We'll be back in a second.
Well, the virus has now killed more than 100 people in China, and new cases have been confirmed around the world.
So you don't want to frighten the American public.
France and South Korea have also got evacuation plans.
But you need to prepare for and assume
strongly warning Americans to avoid all non-essential travel to China.
That this is going to be a real serious problem.
France, Australia, Canada, the US, Singapore, Cambodia, Vietnam, the list goes on.
Health officials are investigating more than 100 possible cases in the US.
Germany, a man has contracted the virus.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
Japan, where a bus driver contracted the virus.
Coronavirus has killed more than 100 people there and infected more than 4,500.
We have to prepare for the worst, always, because if you don't and the worst happens.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Welcome to War Room Pandemic. We're the #1 political podcast in the United States of America. Very proud of that and want to thank everybody in Denver. Real America's Voice, the John Fredericks Radio Network, all of our distribution partners from Roku to Pluto TV, Rumble, YouTube, Facebook, all of it that's made us what we are today or helped us make us what we are. Just really want to thank everybody. Every year on Christmas Day, we do the combat history of Christmas. We always start off with America's really probably the darkest Christmas that America ever had, and that's America's first Christmas in 1776 when an army that had really had one defeat after another since late August, early September, within 60 or 90 days of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, had really been pushed back from Long Island all the way across through Brooklyn Heights, Manhattan, up through White Plains, and all the way down to New Jersey, left New Jersey into Pennsylvania, and then conceived a plan that on Christmas night, in the middle of a storm, would cross the Delaware and launch an attack on a battle-hardened group of mercenaries, German mercenaries called Hessians. So the last question, because we took the whole first hour to go through this, which we normally do anyway, Patrick, because I just love this story so much. You said a double envelopment. I mean, there's so many things they did right against this hardened battle, which they had never been able to pull off, although they never broke, even in their retreats, they never broke this army. How did Washington pull it off? It really is a miracle, but behind the miracle is how did he conceive and pull this off that really saved the American Republic? Because if you hadn't had a victory like this, or you hadn't had some sort of thing that gave people some hope, given the winter you were about to go through, you wouldn't have had an army left. Everybody, people would have just melted away, like you already saw people signing asthma pardons.
The revolution would have been snuffed out if there would not have been a major victory. And it was very conceivable that this could have been a very minor victory where they just, won the battle and Rahl retreated back to one of the other outposts and they would have fought again. But that's not what happened. And it's the grit, it's the determination of, individual soldiers that were, in this army, that they were tenacious. They were at the end of their rope. But Steve, paint the picture here a minute. These guys, many of them didn't have shoes. They were walking in blood-stained trails. No clothing, no winter clothing. but still fighting on. And that's, it's inspiring.
Incredible.
And
the origin myth of this country.
They
Incredible.
hold the bridge at Assun Peak with Washington at their side, and that's an amazing American victory. And it's that morning, that night, that both sides conduct a council of war. Cornwallis, meets with his men, and he basically lays out that they're going to attack at dawn. And according to legend, we're going to bag the old fox in the morning. That was what they said. And, Washington at this point conceives a council of war and decides, he's got his options in place. Does he retreat back across the Delaware, or make a stand, or fight, or advance again? And he comes up with this. It's debatable who designed the plan. It's probably Washington, to attack Princeton, which is the British outpost to, a little bit above Trenton, and then also go on to attack this major war chest, a series of supplies at New Brunswick. And Washington decides to fight again and attack. And they lay out a series of deception plans. They light fires, etc. They make the British believe that they're digging in. Their shovels and pickaxes are hitting the ground with a small group of men to make the British believe that they're digging in for the British attack in the morning. But in what they're actually doing is attacking towards Princeton, and they surprise the British garrison there. But initially, it doesn't go well for the Americans, and the British are quite tenacious. Their commander holds, and several of the American elements in the field retreat. And it's here that Washington's leadership is on full display. He charges in the middle of the battle, where bullets are literally flying all over the place, musket balls, etc., and he is not hit. It's simply a miracle that doesn't occur, because they're aiming at him. But he seems impervious to all this fire, and he rallies the army, and they succeed at Princeton. And it's here that Washington makes a wise decision. He does not go to New Brunswick, because that's where actually Cornwallis anticipates that move. The army is exhausted. They had been fighting for 3 days straight, and they're exhausted. And he decides to march further up into New Jersey, where they set up a winter camp in the high ground there, and it saves the army. And it's really a remarkable story. They turn the tide of the entire revolution.
They turn the tide because they attack on Christmas night. The fighting's on Boxing Day at dawn. And Jack, you've got give us the order he writes on the 27th of
27th. The general, with the utmost sincerity and affection, thanks the officers and soldiers for their spirited and gallant behavior at Trenton yesterday. It is with inexpressible pleasure that he can declare that he did not see a single instance of bad behavior in either officers or privates, and that if any fault could be found, it proceeded from too great an eagerness to push forward upon the enemy. He also then declares that the commissary should distribute rum to all the men, and then we're going to split up the booty. He's obviously in a great mood. But I also wanted to read a letter that he wrote to John Bannister 2 years later, really describing in a private detail the condition of his army at that time. He says, without arrogance or the smallest deviation from truth, it may be said that no history now extant can furnish an instance of an army suffering such uncommon hardships as ours has done, and bearing them with the same patience and fortitude. To see men without clothes to cover their nakedness, without blankets to lie on, without shoes by which their marches might be traced by the blood from their feet, and almost as often without provisions as they marched through the frost and snow, and at Christmas taking up their winter quarters within a day's march of the enemy, without a house or hut to cover them, till they could be built, and submitting to it without a murmur, is a proof of patience and obedience which, in my opinion, can scarce be paralleled.
Incredible. What we owe the founders of this country, and not just the signers of the Declaration, but the deplorables, the hardworking men and women that actually had to deliver the victory. It's just incredible. Talk about courage, talk about valor. We'll get back to General Sherman and Christmas Day in Savannah later, but I want to pivot because we are burning through time here, Patrick, and I want to go now all the way up to World War II. The other great in our our common heritage or knowledge, right? The collective conscious of Bastogne, the Battle of the Bulge, and the Hurtgen Forest. Walk us through that winter of 1944 and what American troops were facing there as they drove to the Rhine and tried to drive. The big hope was to, after D-Day and after this horrific Battle of Normandy, the breakout, to try to have Market Garden. Remember the great paratrooper drop, but to try somehow, there was a concept of trying to end the war by Christmas 1944. That clearly was not going to happen. So walk us through the Hurtgen Forest and the Battle of the Bulge.
No, it wasn't going to happen. And it's here. It's the Factory of Death was called the Hurtgen Forest, and it was a forest that was sort of in the middle of Germany that the Germans had heavily defended. Every inch of that forest, there were bunkers, there were mines everywhere. It was zeroed in with artillery and machine guns, and the Americans command decided to go right through the forest to try to seize it because they felt that there was an opportunity that the Germans had that they might actually try to flank them through using the forest. It was a giant mistake. They should have just bypassed the forest and surrounded it and sealed it off. But instead they attacked headlong through it, which is exactly what the Germans wanted. And it was an incredible disaster. Literally, their casualties there rivaled what we had in the entire Korean War. And it's largely unknown, but the book that I talk about there is called Dog Company, and it's on the 2nd Ranger Battalion. These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc that seized the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc. They during D-Day, the toughest objective. They took out several large guns that were on top of the cliff. They were a little bit further off to the side. They were under nets in an apple orchard, but they disabled them. They scaled this cliff under enemy fire and took the guns. And literally, it's one of the most important objectives of D-Day. But we've got to fast forward a little bit to the Hurtgen Forest. These guys are then the reserve element of Corps Reserve, and they're called upon for special missions in the case of breakthroughs, etc. And that's exactly what happened in December, around December 7th, December 6th, 7th, 7th. The Americans advance outside of the Hurtgen Forest. They break through in a key point, and they're about to seize something called Hill 400, which is the highest ground in the entire Hurtgen Forest. It is vital position for both sides because they can spot with artillery, but the Germans want it held because it overlooks the assembly area for the Battle of the Bulge. So it's the most important real estate in the entire European theater for at this time. And the Rangers, their story is epic. They line up in front of. They take this small town called Bergstein. It's house-to-house fighting, and they line up at dawn in front of Hill 400. And that morning, in early December, middle of December, they attack at dawn, basically, and it's a bayonet attack across an open field. And it's extraordinary stuff. There's a lot of drama that occurs right before the attack. One of the officers who's not very seasoned decides to send out a scout. Many of the men that are seasoned NCOs said, "F you, don't listen to that command." The guy initially doesn't do it, goes out in the middle of the field and is drilled through the head by a German bullet. And that is kind of the spring that breaks. At this point, and these men start charging across that field with fixed bayonets, and they bayonet several of the Germans that are in positions in front of the hill, and they seize it. And then the Germans they throw pretty much everything that they can at it: assault guns, specialized, some of their best infantry units that are German Fallschirmjägers, German paratroopers. This isn't a battle of elites. These elite units face off on Hill 400. And it's an incredible story, Steve, of holding this hill against all odds. And, one of the stories that was most compelling to me is I found in the archives, and it was confirmed through the oral histories that I had done with all of these Rangers. Some of these men are some of my best friends. One of them, Ed Secor, they were so low on ammunition. Their foxhole was being overrun that he pulled 2 German MP-40 Schmeisser submachine guns off of a dead German body and was firing in both hands into this oncoming horde of Germans as they were trying to take out the foxhole. And he held out.
Patrick, put a pin in that right there. We're going to take a short commercial break. We're going to return to December of 1944, the Hurricane Forest and the Battle of the Bulge, with Patrick K. O'Donnell, our combat historian, the story of Dog Company. Jack Maxey, Stephen K. Bannon. We will be back in a moment.
War Room with Stephen K. Bannon. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Okay, welcome back to Merry Christmas. It's Christmas Day, December 25th, the year of our Lord 2020, a historic year for the United States. Every year on this day, we do a combat history at Christmas. We talk about American fighting men and women that have given their all in defense of their country on foreign battlefields and battlefields in the United States. We're at the Hurricane Forest at Hill 400, leading up to the historic Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944 and through Christmas. Jack, you've got a personal...
Yeah, I have an uncle who received his third Purple Heart. He didn't recover in time to get back in the fight at that same battle. And I don't know if it was exactly the Hurricane Forest or the Battle of the Bulge, but he was under artillery fire in a forest, got hit, actually had to lay out in the open for about 10 hours as his buddies threw him ampoules of morphine that he had to inject into himself. And just a wonderful guy. Frank Kelly, American, Irish guy. Just personalizing it.
Did he, what happened to him after the war?
Oh, he went back, got the GI Bill, went to Duke University, became a very, very successful guy, had half a dozen children, lived into his 90s, just a beautiful human being. But it was always sobering as a kid to see him swimming at the beach, you know. He had all the scars to show. And what's interesting about that generation, I never heard of any of those guys getting a disability for having all those injuries.
And they never talked about it either. That's the other thing. Is my father's generation, you just go down with your uncles and stuff. Only later you realize what they went through at Anzio and other places. I want to go back to our combat historian, Patrick K. O'Donnell, that every year donates his time and effort of his great books, which we'll talk about.
It's always an honor to be on your show, Steve.
Well, Patrick, let's go back. We're at the Hurricane Forest. And this is, I think what, people don't understand today is that they think it like July 4th or Independence Day, and they think it's all over. Everybody, we've so made Normandy such a huge deal, which it should be. The greatest amphibious assault in history. That somehow people forget all the rest of it. You had the huge, brutal breakout on Normandy and all those battles. And then you had Patton going to the south and the British under Montgomery trying to do the biggest air assault. Paratrooper landing, memorializing the bridge too far. But you get up there, and they're driving to Berlin. Everybody wants to end the war by Christmas. It's clearly not going to happen. But then for some reason, the high command kind of takes its eye off the ball. There's some reason for the first time there seems to be a really a lapse in either urgency or focus. And you have really this massive battle of which the Hitler and the Wehrmacht bet it all in thinking that they can somehow roll the Western Army, the Allies back in the West, cut some deal, and then stave off the Russians in the East. So what happened? How did we get into this jam, the Hurricane Forest, and then the Battle of the Bulge?
Well, yeah, the Hurricane Forest is this meat grinder, and on Hill 400, they seize the hill, and for 3 days, they're plastered with 18 battalions of German artillery. I mean, this is some of the heaviest artillery that's there. And the reason why the Germans have so much artillery nearby is that they're staging for this Battle of the Bulge, this massive counteroffensive. And the hill overlooks the assembly area on part of the northern part of the Bulge. And the Germans want that hill back at all costs. Dog Company, men of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, they hold it. And that unit, as well as other Army units, report the intelligence that there is there's buildup of German tanks and other units that are in the area. But it's another intelligence failure. The information is gathered, it's sent up the chain of command, and it's ignored. Various things happen, and the Germans quietly assemble a massive, hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of tanks and assault guns and artillery, and they hit what is the Ardennes Forest. This is the area that they attacked in 1940 when they invaded France. So this is considered a rest area or a lighter front on the Western Front, where they send in units, American units largely, or Allied units, to sort of rest and refit, because not much activity is happening. But it's here that Hitler decides to assemble a massive army. They strip bare a large portion, some of their best units from the Eastern Front, the SS, for instance, the Waffen SS, which you're seeing in some of these pictures in these films. They're going to spearhead the main assault or attack at the Battle of the Bulge. And they assemble the men, and on the morning of December 16th, they attack and they surprise the American defenders that are holding the line. The information that was seized at Hill 400 was not conveyed. There's a number of intelligence failures that occur. For instance, the OSS, which actually this is the first CIA / Special Operations Forces. They had a unit that was in that army, but they were removed prior to the Battle of the Bulge, several weeks prior to the Battle of the Bulge. So they didn't really have any. The eyes of that army were gone to some degree, and intelligence was ignored on various levels. So the Germans attack, and the surprise is tremendous. I've interviewed thousands of veterans, and I interviewed members of the German army as well. And many of those, some of the men that I interviewed were actually members of the Waffen SS that attacked that day. And that was a chilling account of how these men, had been battle hardened, they had been defeated, but now they were armed with some of the best weapons that Germany had to offer. They had some of the King Tiger tanks, for instance, as well as other weapons. I remember the one German veteran I interviewed talked about how he saw a jet fly overhead. These guys felt that they were back, and they were ready to attack, and they were excited about it. It was quite, I remember the interview that took place over 40 years after the Battle of the Bulge, and this guy was still, kind of had a tingle, you could tell, when he was relaying that information to me, as they attacked that morning, and they were rolling up Americans left and right. We were fleeing. There was also cases where there were pockets of really heroic Americans that made some final stands that alters the timetable of the entire offensive. With the plan of the Battle of the Bulge is to divide the American and British army, the Allied armies, and drive towards the port of Antwerp. That's the plan, and then somehow create a separate peace. I mean, it's a bit optimistic, but initially that first attack, it succeeds, and the American army, for the most part, there are many instances where they valorously fight, but other instances where they flee, and it's here that I write a book called Beyond Valor. It's my first book, and it's the oral histories of the Rangers and the Airborne, and it's the story of these men, in many cases, at the Battle of the Bulge, and it's about the 82nd Airborne and the 101st Airborne. But I also really captured the stories of what were known as the independent airborne battalions and regiments, such as the 517th Parachute Infantry Regiment. These guys, they dropped in southern France. They were not attached initially to a division, but during the Battle of the Bulge, this was the only reserve available. And the High Command sent both the 82nd, 101st, and these independent units into the Bulge to sort of hold the line at all costs. And these men rolled in there. In many cases, they were on leave or et cetera. They just rolled in with whatever equipment they had. Sometimes these guys didn't even have proper ammunition or grenades. And they rolled in on flatbed trucks, and they charged as quickly as they could towards an area called Bastogne, which was a road network and they were trying to basically plug the line as quickly as possible, because they were the only reserve, essentially the only reserve in the Allied Army. And as they were rolling in, several of the guys that I interviewed, they talked about how they were receiving the ammunition from the retreating American soldiers. They were taking anything they can, ammunition, weapons, anything, because they knew they were going to go in for a fight. And it was the 82nd that goes a little. They pass through Bastogne, and they go up towards the north. And the north is where the SS, the main thrust, is occurring. And they set up in a small series of hamlets, and they block the SS and a place called like Trapon, Chenot, etc. And it's epic stuff, Steve. I mean, not many people know the story of the 82nd and these independent units. They literally fight the SS. I've got a St. Christopher medal on that I wear, that I was given right before Fallujah by a member of the 509, Ernest Williams, and that unit was almost 900 strong before the Battle of the Bulge. They were down to 55 men after they fought the SS, but they held, and they received a presidential unit citation as a result of their extraordinary heroism. But that's the story of the 82nd.
We've got about a minute. We got about a minute. I just want to tee up the 101st when we come back. We got about a minute. So the 82nd goes through Bastogne, because that's kind of a crossroads, and they go up to defend these hamlets against the SS. The 101st gets to defend actually Bastogne, and when we return, I want to tell the heroic story of the 101st. The 101st and what they accomplished, I guess, right up to the Christmas week and then beyond the Christmas holidays. But this is another situation. We'll see it in Chosin Reservoir, where the fighting in the middle of winter is just absolutely brutal, and these happen to be brutal winters that they're undergoing. Okay,
and it's around
Patrick
Christmas.
K. O'Donnell, the combat historian, is gonna return. We're gonna take a short commercial break. Jack Maxey, Stephen K. Bannon. It is the combat history of Christmas on War Room. We will return in just a second.
War Room with Stephen K. Bannon. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Welcome. It is Christmas morning, December 25th, the year of our Lord 2020. You're in the War Room. Every year we do the combat history of Christmas, and we focus on American men and women who have fought on foreign battlefields or in the United States in the Revolution, Civil War, on Christmas Day or through the Christmas season. Jack, you've had a very good observation between segments here.
Well, I mean, while we're in the season of Christmas and Hanukkah, spiritual time of year, I think it's important to recognize the providential nature of the change in weather that occurs so many times through history, both at the Battle of the Brooklyn, both at the invasion in Normandy, just in time to go ahead. And then, obviously, there's the great story of Patton requesting a chaplain to make a prayer for the weather so he could go and relieve Bastogne. And he actually writes he actually gets his printers in his army to print up a card that he has delivered to all of the troops on Christmas Day. And I'll give you the prayer.
Read the prayer.
Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech thee of thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us soldiers who call thee, that armed with thy power we may advance from victory to victory and crush the oppression and wickedness of our enemies and establish thy justice among men and nations. Amen. And then he writes, to each officer and soldier in the 3rd United States Army, I wish a Merry Christmas. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We march in our might to complete victory. May God's blessings rest upon each of you on this Christmas day.
1944. So Patrick K. O'Donnell, the 101st at Bastogne, the 82nd goes through and defends the hamlets and takes on the Waffen SS north of here. How does the 101st draw Bastogne? What happens?
The 101st, along with an assortment of other Army units that had fallen back, retreat to Bastogne, and they defend a series of the strategic hamlets or villages surrounding Bastogne. Bastogne is vitally important because it's called a road octopus, because there's so many roads that flow out from Bastogne. And the German army desperately wants it to make their advance towards Antwerp. The 101st is there. They position themselves in and around these small hamlets, and they dig in. They have M1 Garands, primarily light weapons, 30 caliber machine guns in some cases, a few bazookas here and there, and then they have to fight against German armor. And they are in foxholes in and around Bastogne. It's around the 22nd of December that they surround Bastogne, and the German commander then presents the 101st Acting Division commander at the time, Anthony McAuliffe, with an ultimatum. Surrender. It's the honorable thing to do. And he responds with one word: nuts. Which is the iconic response, and it drives the Germans nuts, literally. And they try to attack again, and they're thrown back in each case.
Patrick, can I? It didn't originally. I understand when they went to the general and they said, "Hey, listen, they've got a surrender letter here." He said, "So they're surrendering," and they said, "Oh no, General, they're asking us to surrender." He originally throws the letter to the floor and says "nuts," and then they later convince him to make that the message.
They were pretty upset about that. And the 101st digs in even harder, and they pretty much repel everything that the Germans throw against them. The 101st, as well as these other, there's several tank destroyer units, elements of the 10th Armor in there, an assortment of men. This is an Alamo sort of situation, and they hold and do an incredible job of holding. And what happens is the momentum up north, thanks to the 82nd and other units, is slowed down. The drive across the Meuse River and towards Antwerp is failing. So Bastogne becomes a symbolic place. Hitler realizes that it has to be seized at all cost. And he starts to take the units that were up north and moves them down south towards Bastogne, and they start to really throw everything they can to destroy Bastogne, because they realize it's a political victory potentially if they're able to seize the town and take it out. But the Americans hold. They put in more reinforcements. The 17th Airborne comes in, and then ultimately Patton's army is able to thrust from the south and then join up. But that's not the end of the Battle of the Bulge. This thing wages and rages for over a month and well into January. And there's this bitter house-to-house, hand-to-hand fighting that occurs in this incredibly tundra-like weather, the coldest weather in history in Europe, up until this point in a long time. And men are just poorly equipped to deal with it. And they don't have proper winter clothing and everything else. Most of these guys that I interviewed had something called trench foot. They were frozen feet because they didn't have the proper equipment to deal with the weather. Their hands were frozen, etc. And they had to deal with all this stuff.
Yeah, for a time we eventually held off the Germans, and it became one of the great. My daughter, after graduate at West Point, served with the 101st in Iraq. And I remember she was, I think, the 326 Combat Engineers. I went to Fort Campbell to see her the first time I saw her, and we would go to their headquarters, and they've got, you walk in and they got these massive Nazi flags, all the flags that they took from these battles. And of course, Bastogne is symbolic of the grit and determination of the 101st. So it's they go into legend in that. But while we're on weather, and I think it's one of the connective tissues of this story about the Christmas season, a brutal winter in 1776, a brutal winter at the time, the worst recorded in Western Europe in 1944, and now we get to really where the weather is the major features in American history. When you think of the Chosin Reservoir and you think of Korea, the first thing you think about is the minus 40 degrees. And these troops were not, Dog Company were the Ranger Battalion that took a point to Hock and were the famous, where Reagan made that speech and later became so famous for what they did. These were, these were the elite troops. Right, and that's why they're in Hill 400, and in Bastogne you had the 101st, and you had the 82nd or the 517. But you get to the Korean War. America always wants to. After the war, we just want to kind of wash our hands of it. That's it. We're going home. In Korea, which happens, this is 5 years after in 1950. 5 years after the end of World War II, after the surrender of the Japanese. You're basically in Korea, and these troops are not trained at all, not ready at all. The Marine and Army troops, they get into Korea, and it is a nightmare beyond comprehension. Your book, Give Me Tomorrow, is absolutely stunning. It's one of the most moving books I've ever read. Walk us through the Christmas season of, I guess it's 1950, right? The Christmas of 1950, the season where at the Chosin Reservoir, the Marines and the Army, and particularly the Marines, the most famous legendary, I guess, what they've done. Walk us through it.
This is, their story begins in the summer of 1950, where America is basically demobilized, demilitarized. They go from, a massive war budget to hardly anything. And the 1st Marine Division is a shell of its former self. They don't have even the men to staff up the entire division. And they call anybody that they can. And they had the men of George Company, which Give Me Tomorrow is about. These men many of them were reservists. And they're not reservists in the sense that we know today. These guys didn't even have boot camp in some cases, which a lot of people find extraordinary for Marines, but it's true. They didn't go to boot camp. They didn't even know how to throw a grenade properly or anything. And they were mobilized quickly in the summer of 1950. And these were the boys that were part of MacArthur's great counter offensive in Korea at Incheon. They were the first wave to attack at Incheon, which is outside of Seoul. And this turns the entire Korean War around, where there was a perimeter, just shortly before that, where the North Koreans had surrounded most of South Korea in this small perimeter called the Pusan Perimeter. There were some American units in there that were holding against all odds. But this counteroffensive in Incheon changes the entire course of the war. And from there, we advance quickly towards the north and the Yalu River and the border with China. And it's here that, Mao Zedong sees what's going on and decides to throw his a large portion of his army into the fray to stop the Americans and defeat them. And they advance across the Yalu River at night. They do it very stealthily, to the point that MacArthur does not believe that the China will be involved in this war.
Is this another intelligence failure? The Yalu River, for folks at home, is that what separates Korea from China. Was this an intelligence failure? Because the Army, and by the way, we now know in history that a lot of this was the Nationalist Army that Mao, as I've gotten to know the Chinese better, they say, hey, they sent those kids there to die. You think your guys were ill-trained. These guys didn't even have weapons. Mao didn't trust the generals. He wanted wave after wave to die there. But was this an intelligence failure? Was MacArthur caught by surprise on this?
It was a combination of things. It was a intelligence failure. But also it was MacArthur's own hubris in most cases. He just didn't want to believe that the Chinese would overturn all of this great success that he achieved. And he just sort of ignored things. He would simply, he would receive intelligence and then downplay it. And he was constantly downplaying everything, and he wasn't preparing for the eventuality of a massive series of massive Chinese armies that would first surround the main force, the Eighth Army, in sort of the central portion of Korea, and then also MacArthur's 10th Corps, which included primarily the 1st Marine Division on the other side of the Korean Peninsula. And it's here that the Chosin Reservoir, which is up towards the Chinese border, it's not terribly far from the Yala River, but the Chinese sneak across the river and then they assemble a massive army around both Allied forces. The Give Me Tomorrow revolves around the Chosin Reservoir, where the 1st Marine Division is surrounded by tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers. And that's the epic stand that these men may have to make near Christmas time. And it's in the most harsh and brutal temperatures that you can imagine, Steve. I mean, these guys did not have any winter clothing. They did not. The men at George Company didn't have food.
Patrick, hang on for 1 second. We got to take a short commercial break. In 30 or 40 degree minus weather, with not winter clothing, the 1st Marine Division took a stand at the Chosin Reservoir. Patrick K. O'Donnell, the author of Give Me Tomorrow, will return and walk us through this heroic stand over the Christmas season of 1950.
War Room with Stephen K. Bannon. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Merry Christmas, December 25th, the year of our Lord 2020, a historic year for the United States of America, but we've been here through dark days before. We're now in Christmas of 1950, and we are in Korea. Jack, walk us through a couple other things that happened on Christmas.
Well, as we talk about Providence, also when they escaped from the Chosin Reservoir, and it's actually the symbol of the veterans, there's something called the Star of Koto-ri. And on the night of 7th to 8th of December, they had very bad weather. They could not get air support. They had to get across the bridge at Koto-ri, and the star appeared in the early dawn sky. And there's stories of Marines seeing the star and feeling that it was a sign that God had favored them, and they began singing Silent Night in their little tents, trying to keep warm. It's kind of an interesting story. And then also, I hope Patrick will cover it too, the final evacuation from Chosin ends up at a port called Hungnam on December 24th is the final day they leave, and they remove 100,000 Korean refugees, and today there are over 1 million descendants of those people.
Incredible. Patrick, take us back to that moment, minus 40 degrees, wave after wave of Chinese soldiers, many without guns, right? How do they get out? How do you get down to actually get the Koreans out? How do you get to December 24th? The odds are against you. You're not clothed for this. You don't have the weapons for it. These Marine reservists have not been trained. You're surrounded by an army who was sent there essentially to die, but to make sure the Americans die with you. How do you get out of the Chosin Reservoir?
Steve, the story here is one of George Company 3-1, who I met after I came back from Fallujah. And their story is remarkable, and it was untold prior to that. They had to literally break into the Chosin Reservoir. They were one of the units that was kind of left behind near Koto-ri, and they had to get to a place called Haguru-ri, where the 1st Marine Division had to assemble. But they were also building an airfield to bring in supplies and take out the wounded. It was all about time, and they had to charge up a 12-mile road in a place called Hellfire Valley, which was surrounded by an entire Chinese division. And they had to break through to Haguru-ri, which they did, but at great cost. There's something called Task Force Drysdale, and nearly half of that task force was destroyed. But the tanks and the men of George Company had to get through at all costs because they needed the reinforcements at Hagar-Ri to build the airfield and hold the town so that the rest of the First Marine Division could eventually advance outward towards Hagnum. And it's here that George Company is on that road, and they literally have to fight hill to hill to break through. And my book begins with the gunnery, the master sergeant who was in charge of the men, Rocco Zulo, who was manning a 50 caliber machine gun on one of those trucks. And he is spraying Chinese soldiers left and right. They make it towards the gates of Hagar-Ri, and they are approached by They're approached by American soldiers, at least they think so. But they're actually Chinese soldiers that are wearing American uniforms, and they at that point they shoot Zulo through the stomach several times. And I'll never forget, I interviewed him, and he showed me his stomach, and he lifted it up as there was all these scars across the stomach. But everyone in that unit thought he was dead, and they put him on a pile of bodies that were about 8 feet high with dead Marines, and they left him. Another unit came back, and they heard a cough about 8 hours later, and they revived him. But none of those men of George Company knew that he had survived until 30 years after the war, when he came to the first reunion. And that's the beginning of my book, Give Me Tomorrow. But there, they break through at Hagar-Ri, and they are tasked with holding East Hill, the most important real estate of the Chosin Reservoir. It overlooks Hagar-Ri, and they hold it at all costs. These men don't have any food. They're only supplied with Tootsie Roll Pops. That's their food, and their water supply is snow. And this is 30 to 40 below degrees with the wind chill and everything else. But they hold that hill against massive Chinese human wave assault attacks. Chinese, in many cases, as you mentioned earlier, don't have weapons, and they just attack left and right.
Wave after wave. Okay, we're running out of time. I got to have the cover of the book and the title of the book. It's one of the most moving photographs I've ever seen. And tell us the title. Tell us the story of that photo.
One of the most famous photographer, David Duncan Douglas, was assigned to the 1st Marine Division, and he was taking photos, and he, sort of cheekily asked Marine, if you could have anything for Christmas, what would it be? And that Marine, who was with George Company, responded, "Give me tomorrow." And his wish was almost not granted. That night, they were attacked by a Chinese human wave attack. Their machine gun position was nearly overrun, and he nearly died that night. Many of the men barely survived. But it sets up this evacuation / advance in another direction, as the Marines like to say. And they lined up the 1st Marine Division, and they then advanced towards the sea. And it was, quite a spectacular assault.
Okay, we're gonna have to bounce, but I got to have the indispensables. We're going to get that up and make sure that people, our audience is an audience of readers. We got one of the biggest audiences in the world.
Pre-order it.
Tell us when's the indispensable? When is it up on Amazon as of today?
It is. You can pre-order it. We're going to be publishing in May, and I really look forward to talking to you about that book more when it comes out. It's it's a truly extraordinary story, like Washington's Immortals. It's a band of brothers on these men. It captures the main characters of that unit that really did change the course of the American Revolution.
Listen, your books, Patrick K. O'Donnell, just go to Amazon. Any book you order is going to be like a novel. You're not going to be able to put it down. Here's the reason. He goes in with these 5,000 interviews he's done. He builds these characters from their own words, and it's just absolutely incredible. From the Revolution to World War II to the Korean War to the Battle of Fallujah, We Are One. I made a film with Michael Pack about Fallujah, and his book, Patrick K. O'Donnell's book, was incredible. So, Patrick, thank you. Merry Christmas. Thank you for doing it once again. The
Merry
Combat
Christmas
History
also,
of Christmas.
Steve. Thank you.
We want to thanks the Real America's Voice team, John Fredericks, the guys in Denver that helped produce this, Dan Fluitt, the entire team. Jack, Merry Christmas, brother.
Merry Christmas. Be not afraid, peeps.
Everything's just beginning for the games you want to play. Bring it on and I will fight to the end. Just watch and see. It's all started, everything's begun, and you are over. 'Cause we're taking down the CCP.